Hello. This is actually one of my first videos speaking directly to you, and I wanted to talk a little bit today about an infographic that I created along with Jordan Syatt, and it's called The Beginner's Guide to Building Muscle. I've gotten a lot of traffic mainly from Reddit. A lot of people shared it on Facebook, Twitter, got a few Pinterest shares. To everyone that's shared it, we really appreciate it. It's been super cool to see all the responses, and it's been, kind of fun to see some of the people get opinionated on Reddit and some other, areas on the internet. But today, I just want to make a short video and just want to answer some questions that have come up with some of my readers. Some of the people on Reddit, actually, Dick Talons shared this on his Photocracy profile. So, Dick, thanks a lot for that. I appreciate it. And we're going to go over some questions that came up there. I'm going to kind of cover, I'm going to go through the infographic and just cover different areas of it and kind of explain it, and then help you realize exactly who this is for. So I'm going to look back at my computer here a little bit and kind of go over some notes. As you can see, I've got it all pulled up here. And back here. There we go. So first thing is, I want everyone to know that this is a beginner's guide to building muscle. This is not a beginner's guide to losing fat. This is not a beginner's guide to HIIT training. This is not a beginner's guide to, recomping or becoming a fitness model or anything like that. It's not a beginner's guide to becoming the best athlete you can be. The main thing I want to reiterate again is this is a beginner's guide for building muscle. And I made the graph the way I did to go with the article that I wrote with Jordan. And we basically took the most important things we think are important for a beginner to know. So keep that in mind if you're one of those people that were looking at it and say, oh, well, JC and Jordan left this out, or they didn't add this, or they talk bad about HIIT training or whatever. So I'm going to go through a couple things and just kind of clear up a few questions and some things that came up. So number one, the images in the Learn the Movement section. I want you to know that I'm not an illustrator. So you put me in Adobe Illustrator and I'm completely lost. I'm really good for an amateur with Photoshop, and I can pretty much manipulate it, and I can bend it to my will pretty much. So I created all of this in Photoshop. I actually had hired this out for someone to do it, and I didn't like how it turned out. So in the Learn the Movement section, I basically chose images that I got off of stock photo websites. So this saved me a ton of time from trying to create my own silhouettes and create my own graphics, and I just paid for them and I manipulated them to how I wanted them. So that's why we have some images that may not be the best form, and frankly, I don't really care. I just put them there as an illustration to say, hey, this is sort of what it looks like. These are the movements, but it's in no way, shape, or form supposed to represent perfect form on the deadlift or perfect form on the bench press. I know I got a lot of people saying, well, you shouldn't put your feet on the bench whenever you're doing a bench press, and I completely agree with that. The main thing you want to do on a bench press is keep your feet planted on the floor so you have stability, and it also gives you a little more power. But outside of that, it's just an illustration. It was just for the infographic. It wasn't supposed to say this is the proper form. Same thing with bent over rows. So a lot of people, in the description, I have bent over rows, and I say, bent over rows are good, blah, 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 blah. There's variations. Actually, what I have on the infographic is a T-bar row. And a lot of people were saying, well, this is not a bent over row, this is a T-bar row. T-bar row is technically a variation of a bent over row. So, sorry if you were mad that it wasn't a traditional pin lay row from the floor or a bent over row. There is a million ways to do any of the movements. There's a bunch of ways to do deadlifts, presses, rows. You can do variations of chin-ups, pull-ups. You get the point. The second thing I want to go over is the calorie recommendations. When Jordan and I were putting this outline together, we have to cover a large amount of people. Like we're not working one-on-one with anyone here, so these numbers are averages. And the reason we chose 16 to 18 calories per pound of body weight to shoot for whenever you're looking to build muscle is basically because a lot of people on the average are going to maintain their body weight from anywhere from 13, 14, or 15 calories per pound of body weight. Some people are a little bit less, some people a little high, but in the end it's just an average. You know, there are really no absolutes, so if you are following this guide and you're eating 18 calories per pound and you notice that you're not gaining weight, you're not getting much stronger, you know, up your calories a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. If you notice that you're gaining too fast and you don't really want to gain 2 pounds a week, which we don't really recommend, tone it down a little bit. Take it down to 16 calories, you know, per pound or whatever it is. Just make sure you make an adjustment from where you started. The next thing I want to cover is there was actually some talk on Photocracy about why Jordan and I didn't recommend the GOMAD diet. If you're not familiar with GOMAD, it's basically the gallon of milk a day diet. And if you're familiar with starting strength and the origins of starting strength and how a lot of guys train and eat on the program, you've probably heard of this diet. Basically, you're drinking a gallon of milk a day alongside all of your other food. And when you break it all down, that's a lot of calories for anyone. I don't care who you are. A gallon of milk in itself has a ton of fat, a ton of carbs, a ton of protein, and I personally don't really recommend this diet to anyone, simply because I find it's a little more practical just to eat, you know, regular food than to slam a gallon of milk every single day. A lot of times people have stomach issues when you drink that much milk. Another thing is that it's not very practical for the person who is sedentary. Think about this. If you're a beginner and let's say you are in your mid to late 20s and you have a desk job, I don't really think drinking a gallon of milk on top of all your other food that you're eating is going to be the best strategy, because chances are all those excess calories, aside from the amount that's going to build muscle and to build strength, a lot of that's going to convert to fat tissue because you have too much of a caloric surplus. I debated with this guy for a while about GOMAD and why I didn't include it, and basically I even wrote an article, and I'll leave that in the bottom of this video. You can reference that if you like, about GOMAD. The third thing that I want to talk about is pre- and post-workout meal suggestions. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I'm actually pulling up the thread right now on Photocracy. So, as I mentioned earlier, Dig Talent shared this, and a lot of people, it was well received. And then I got a couple guys. One guy mainly, he started the conversation, and he says, "Eating carbs pre-workout is bro science for everyone except endurance athletes. Studies have shown no increased performance from it, and it blunts fat oxidation." So I can't argue with that. I pretty much agree. I go on and I respond and I said, "Carbs pre-workout are definitely not necessary for most, but for the beginner who's trying to get this right and build a solid foundation for strength and size gains, I'd say it's pretty good advice. Bro science or not, Jordan and I thought it was important enough to put it in there." And he comes back with a response and says, "I'm unclear as to how it helps a beginner lifter. A beginner lifter of all people is the one not even coming close to taxing his glycogen reserve, since his limiting factor is going to be his CNS for the first month or so." So before I go into my response, basically what this guy's doing is he's nitpicking. And nitpicking is fine and dandy. You know, I've done my share of nitpicking. I've done my share of arguing on the internet. I don't really have time for that anymore. But the point I want to hammer home is that a beginner lifter doesn't need to be thinking about all these details when it comes to the exact workout, pre and post workout nutrition, you know, whether or not they're topping off their glycogen stores. whether or not they're training optimally at the certain time of day. Like what I'm getting at is like the details are not really that important as long as you hit your macros by the end of the day. As long as you're hitting your recommended protein, carbs, and fat by the end of the day, you're training hard 3 or 4 times a week, you're going to make the gains that you want to, regardless of whether you have a pre-workout meal, a post-workout meal, whether or not you decide to train in the morning and the afternoon. It's not really that big of a deal. So here was my response. I said, so you think it's a better idea to give no guidelines at all on how or when to eat to someone who doesn't really have a clue on how this stuff works together? The truth is, pre-workout carbs aren't really necessary, but it's not a bad thing to recommend them pre-workout either. I like to keep it very simple for beginners. Later, when they're a bit more familiar with training and diet, then we can talk about adjusting their intake or removing their pre-workout meals. And a lot of this ties into how fasting has become really popular. And there's a lot of people that are training fasted. There's a lot of people that are waiting to train later in the day in a fasted state at like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. They train and they go home and then they pound a lot of carbs and protein. I've personally done that. I like that approach. It's fit me very well. I don't do that anymore just because for right now it's not practical with my schedule. Hit your macros by the end of the day is the most important thing. So he writes back, and I promise I'm almost done with this. He says, I didn't say that. The difference isn't going to be very large and therefore not important to a beginner anyway. I just think it's important not to propagate things with no scientific support. The fitness industry is chaotic enough place as it is. So I can't really get mad at this guy. I don't really care, honestly. It's obvious that he hasn't read much of my work, which, I'm just a fish in the sea. He's probably reading, who knows who he's reading. It doesn't matter. The main point is that he's nitpicking. Again, this is all details. So later on down the line, we kind of hash it out a little more, and Dick comes in and he says something that I was thinking and I wish I had said, but he said it great. He said, so keep in mind that helping people is not only a science game, but a psychology game as well. For example, the worst thing that someone can do to help your average Joe looking to lose weight is tell them to skip breakfast, keep an 8-hour feeding window, and stick to whatever macros that you give him. That may work with certain personas, in general, like basically the people that already know about this stuff and that have read the science and have read about intermittent fasting, that have read John Romaniello's stuff or Martin Berkin's stuff or Brad Pilon, people that are in the know, so to speak. But it's not going to work for the regular beginner. They've already got too much stuff to think about. And he says, but crafting a program and a message that beginners can digest and stick to is equally, if not more important. So when it all comes down to it, Jordan and I wanted to make this as simple as possible, and we think we did just that. We think that we made it simple enough that any beginner can get started using the programs we set up, using the diet and calorie guidelines, and using the supplement guidelines if they choose to, if that's what they want to do. So now we have the fourth thing that I want to go over, and it is why Jordan and I don't recommend HIIT training, other words known as high intensity interval training. So we're looking at stuff like sprints, stationary bike intervals, any type of training that is super intense. Basically, you're going all out for 15 or 20 seconds as hard as possible, and then you rest for 30, 40 seconds, maybe a minute, and then you go at it again. So we got a lot of heat about this, basically saying that HIIT training is a lot better than regular cardio, and it's not a good idea to not recommend HIIT training. And I just want to give our opinion and why we decided not to. For one, let's just define what strength training is. So if you're going into the gym 3 times a week and you're trying your hardest to lift heavier weights every time you go in there, you're working near failure on your work sets, and every time you go into the gym, you're trying to get better. That's high intensity training. A lot of times people will start off and it's really taxing for the first 3 or 4 weeks because they've never done any type of training like this. And I think people fail to realize sometimes that training with barbells and weight training is high intensity training. So what happens when you're already training 3 times a week and then you add sprints and bike intervals and all this high intensity cardio on top of that. Most people are going to burn out really quickly because they haven't built up a work capacity. And some people will even injure themselves simply because they're just not used to doing all this. And so we just don't recommend doing any high intensity interval training for a beginner. After they've acclimated to the training loads and they want to incorporate this into their programming, that's fine. Again, if your ultimate goal is to build as much muscle and much strength as you possibly can, we think training 3 or 4 times a week, hard and heavy, and leaving the other 3 or 4 days to rest, just to simply relax and chill out. You know, you can go to the gym and do some mobility drills. You can even do some light walking like we recommend in the guide. But other than that, if your ultimate goal is to build as much muscle and as much strength as possible, probably don't want to train that intensely 6 to 7 times a week. The last thing I want to talk about, point number 5, is somebody on Reddit, and I'm only throwing this in there because it kind of ticked me off, but he basically says, this infographic seems to care just about getting into shape rather than working on all muscle groups like the heart. I really don't like these kinds of people. They seem superficial. Maybe I am superficial. I don't know. First of all, this guide is not about improving cardiovascular health. That's not the goal. We wrote this for beginners who are lost and who got their nose in magazines and who are reading advanced training materials, who have no business doing this type of training. We wrote this for the beginner that doesn't really know much about it and needs something to get started, and that's what it's for. It's not for working on your cardio health. It's not working on becoming, like I said earlier, it's not working on becoming a better athlete, and it's strictly for building muscle and building strength. So in saying that, thanks a lot for watching. Thanks a lot for spreading the infograph that Jordan and I created. If you like it, please share it on Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter. That would help us a bunch in terms of getting it seen. Hopefully I answered your questions. If you have any more questions, leave them in the comment section on YouTube. You can actually leave them in the comment section on my article on jcdfitness.com, or you can send me an email, whatever you want to do. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you next time.